Permanent data storage is a crucial skill to have under your belt as an iOS app developer. So far, all of the variables that we've created have been destroyed as soon as the app is shut down. But for most apps, you're going to want to store some information about the user so that when they come back to the app, they get their data straight away. There are a number of ways to achieve this, and I'm going to show you the simplest one in this video. So let's start a new project. The usual single view application. We'll call it permanent data storage and save it on the desktop. So what we're going to be using in this app is something called user defaults, which, as you might imagine, is designed for storing some basic information about that particular user. But really, you can use it to store any information locally on the device. And it's pretty easy to set up. We just use user defaults with a capital U dot standard. So we're using the standard user defaults. And if we want to set a particular value, we use set. And then we might want to set the value Rob for a certain key, and that key might be name. So this would save a value in user defaults with a name of name and a value of Rob. Then if we want to get that back, we would do something like let variable name equal, and again we'll use user defaults and the standard user defaults, and this time we're going to retrieve an object for key, and the key is name. And then finally, for now, we'll just print name to the console to make sure that that's worked. So pretty simple. We just save the item to user defaults using some code like this, which sets up a variable called name and gives it a value Rob. And then when we want to bring that back, we use userdefaults.standard.object, and then we give the key, which in this case is name. So with any luck, that will print Rob to the logs. And there it is. You can see that it's an optional because there's a possibility that there is no object for that particular key name, but we know there is because we just saved it. So just to prove to you that this is indeed saved permanently, let's run the app again, but this time we'll comment out the saving part. So we should find that it does the exact same thing, which means that it's stored that piece of data permanently and we can access it whenever we load the app. And there we go. You can see it's returned the value just as before. So we've saved it permanently. It's worth seeing briefly how we check whether or not name has a value, because we want to be careful about using optionals if we don't know whether or not they exist. And what we can do there is we could change this to be name object, and then we can run the setup that we saw earlier in the previous chapter. If let name is equal to, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take name object and attempt to cast it to a string, so let's just run that again. While it's running, I'll explain what's going on here. So first off, it's worth noting that we're returning an object here, which is not necessarily a string. So it's going to return something, hopefully, but it won't necessarily be a string. So what we're checking here is, are we able to take our name object and convert it or cast it to a string? And if we are, then we'll print it. And if not, for now, we won't do anything. So this is a much safer way of checking not only whether an object exists, but whether it's of a certain type. And there we go. So you can see now we can use Rob, and it's not an optional anymore. When we use if let, the variable called name will not be an optional, because if the statement has turned out to be true, then name definitely has a value. So I'd certainly recommend using structures like this when you're working with user defaults and you're not certain whether or not you've already saved something. We'll be using this structure again and again in future apps, as it is a very useful one. All right, so that's how we save just a simple string. What about saving something a little bit more complicated, say an array? So let's start off by creating an array. We'll just have a very simple one, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we actually use exactly the same code to save it as before. So user defaults dot standard dot set, and this time the value of the object that we want to set is array, or ARR, for this variable here. And we'll use the word array as our key. So that will then set the array. And if we want to get it back, we do exactly the same thing as before. So I'll set up an array object. This is going to be user defaults dot standard dot object for key, and this time the key is array. So once again, be aware that array object is going to be an optional, because we don't know at this point for certain whether this key has a value, although we're pretty certain that it does because we've just saved it there. But also be aware that it's not going to be an array, it's going to be a general object. So we're going to do a test for both its existence and whether it can be converted into an array in the same way as before. So if let array equals array object as array, then we'll print it. And a small thing there, I think that needs to be NS array rather than a general array. Okay, so let's have a look. We should now see Rob as before, but also we should see this array that we can then deal with however we would normally process an array. And there we go. So there's Rob and the array. And once again, let's just be absolutely sure that we have saved this permanently by commenting out. And in fact, we don't need that anymore either. And there we go. We've got exactly the same output as before, even though we're not actually saving or defining the array this time. All right, so fairly straightforward. I'm going to give you a challenge to create something vaguely useful out of this. So what we're going to do is create an app that very simply remembers a user's phone number. This might seem like a fairly pointless app, but it is something that several people that I know seem to struggle with. So it's simply going to be when we load up the app, it invites the user to enter their phone number. And then once they've entered it, the next time they load it, it shows them what their number is. Simple as that. You can design the UI as you like, but try not to look back at this if you can possibly avoid it when you're writing the permanent data storage part. Off you go. Best of luck. All right then, here we go. So this should be a fairly simple app for us. Stick with single view application. I'm going to call it what's my number, and sorry for apostrophe pedants there, but I'm going to leave that out just because, as I've mentioned, putting strange characters into the title there can cause problems. All right. So I'm not going to worry too much about the UI here. Just something pretty simple. We'll start off with a label at the top there. What's my number? And we'll keep that centered horizontally. Be good to select it first. And vertically, we'll link it to the top of the screen. There we go. And then we'll have a text field. Which I'll stretch out to the edge there. And I'll set vertical. A button, which we'll put underneath, and we'll center horizontally and add a vertical constraint to the text field. And we'll just call that save. All right, that's all we need for the UI. So let's bring in our view controller .swift. There we go, back to main storyboard on the left. And then I'm control dragging there. And I'll call that number field, and outlet is fine. And then for the save button, I'm going to control drag, and I'll just call it save. And it's an action. All right, so when the user saves, all we need to do is save that to user defaults. So user defaults dot standard dot set, and the value that we need is the value of number field, and this is number field dot text, and we'll use the key number. There we go. And then when the app loads, we're going to test to see if there is a number saved. And if there is, we'll display it to the user. So let number object be equal to user defaults dot standard dot object for key, and the key is number. And then we'll test to say if let number is equal to number object as, and we're going to cast it to a string. Even though it will likely be a number, we need it as a string anyway, and we could have problems if the user enters some text for some reason. So it's really simpler to keep everything as a string. So if that's the case, then we'll take number field and we'll set the text equal to number. So simple as that. One small addition that I should have made at the beginning is changing the keyboard type to a number pad. And that's it. Pretty straightforward. So let's see it in action. The only thing I haven't done here is given the user any kind of confirmation that it's been successfully saved, which would be quite easy to set up with a label under here. So feel free to add that in to your app, but I'll just leave it as is for now. All right, here we go. So what's my number? I'm just going to enter 1, 2, 3, 4, and then tap save. And then I'm going to restart the app. From within Xcode, and with any luck, when we rerun it, we should see the number in the text field. And there it is. Beautiful. So that's a very basic use of permanent data storage. We're heading towards a much more advanced use, which is our to-do app, which we'll be making in a couple of videos' time. But there's a few things that we need to get to grips with before we can make the to-do list app. And the first that we're going to look at is another fundamental of iOS development, and that is having multiple view controllers and segueing between them. And we'll see exactly how to do that in the next video.